No one in the room was prepared for what unfolded the moment Suga BTS stepped onto the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live, dressed in a sleek black suit that molded perfectly to his frame, his black hair falling softly around his face, his expression unreadable yet commanding the entire studio's attention in a way that felt almost supernatural. And Jimmy Kimmel himself, usually quick with humor or warm greetings, didn't offer the typical "we're so glad you're here" or "welcome to the show." Instead, he leaned forward slightly with an unreadable smirk and dropped a single question that shattered the air like glass. "Suga, what's the one thing you've never told anyone publicly but wish the world knew right now?" And the entire studio fell into a deep silence that was almost uncomfortable. Not a single movement, not even a breath from the crowd, as the camera slowly zoomed in on Suga's face, his eyes blinking once, then twice, before shifting briefly toward the audience and finally returning to Jimmy as he replied in a voice that was low, certain, and carrying a strange weight. "I think people forget I'm a human before I'm an artist." And the simplicity of those words, the vulnerability wrapped in that sentence, stunned even Jimmy, who paused for a split second before asking softly, "Do you feel invisible sometimes, even though the world sees you everywhere?" To which Suga responded with a slow nod, "Yes, I feel seen, but I'm not sure I'm understood." Then gave a small laugh, not of joy but of exhausted truth, the kind of laugh you give when the truth is too heavy to say without it, and the atmosphere in the studio began to shift into something deeper, more intimate, as if the bright stage lights dimmed in resonance with the honesty unraveling on that very couch, and Jimmy, sensing the rawness of the moment, leaned in further, his voice quieter now, more personal, asking, "Then tell me what you want them to understand." And this time Suga didn't speak right away. He exhaled slowly, twisted the ring on his finger as if grounding himself, then said with the most piercing clarity, "That I didn't choose music to be famous, I chose it to survive." And the moment those words left his lips, you could almost hear the collective gasp of realization from the audience, one girl in the front row covering her mouth as her eyes welled up. And Jimmy blinked a few times, visibly moved, eventually, whispering, "That's powerful." But Suga only shrugged and replied, "It's just true," then offered a faint smile, one not directed at the host, nor the crowd, but perhaps at his own inner self who had waited years to say that sentence aloud. And just as Jimmy was about to transition, a spontaneous voice echoed from the back of the studio, someone yelling with raw sincerity, "We love you, yoongi." And the timing was so flawless, so unfiltered, that Suga actually closed his eyes for a second, his smile softening, as if that one sentence was a healing balm he didn't expect but deeply needed. And right then Jimmy straightened up, glanced at the cue cards in his hand with hesitation, and then looked Suga straight in the eye with an intensity that made even the cameraman adjust his angle, saying, "You know, I had this question written down but I wasn't sure I'd ask it, but now I think I have to." And in that pause before he even asked it, attention fell over the crowd like a sudden storm, and everyone knew from the shift in Jimmy's tone that whatever was coming next wasn't planned, wasn't pre-approved by any PR team, and could possibly be the most unforgettable moment of the night. As Jimmy's eyes locked with Suga's in a way that made even the studio lights feel like they dimmed a little, he slowly turned the card in his hand upside down as if deciding it no longer mattered. Then, without reading anything, he leaned closer and asked with a voice that was more human than, "Host, what scares you the most now that you're back in front of the world?" And Suga didn't flinch, didn't shift in his seat, but there was a subtle tightening in his jaw, a twitch in his left hand that only someone really paying attention could notice, and then he replied, not instantly but with intention, as if choosing every word carefully, "That I won't recognize myself after all this." And the silence that followed was heavy, not awkward but weighted, like everyone in the room understood. Without fully understanding, and Jimmy didn't interrupt, he let the words breathe, he let Suga sit in it, and when the rapper continued, his voice steadier this time, "It's easy to become the version people love, but that version is not always the one you love." Something in that moment cracked open, because this wasn't just a K-pop idol talking. This was a man pulling back a curtain few ever dare to touch, and the audience leaned in as if collectively drawn into his inner monologue now turned audible, and Jimmy finally whispered, "So who are you now, sitting here?" And Suga gave a half smile, eyes scanning the ceiling like searching for stars in a midnight city, before answering, Someone's still figuring it out, but at least now, I'm not pretending I have the answer. And the beauty of that admission rippled across the room. You could sense a shift not just in tone but in the connection between guest and host, and even Jimmy, who'd interviewed hundreds of celebrities, looked slightly humbled, as if realizing this wasn't content anymore. This was confession, and then he changed the direction suddenly but softly. There's been a lot of talk about how quiet you've been these days. Some fans say they miss your fire, your anger, your rawness. And Suga smirked, tilted his head slightly and replied, "Anger has a price. Sometimes you pay it with silence." And Jimmy raised his eyebrows, clearly taken aback by how lyrical yet loaded that response was, and followed it up with, "Do you regret silencing yourself then?" To which Suga shook his head slowly and said, "No, because in silence, I learned to listen." And there was something almost poetic about how the room responded, with no applause, no cheer, just pure undisturbed attention, like a collective inhale waiting for something unknown. And then Jimmy leaned back slightly, glanced toward the audience and said, "I think this might be the quietest this room has ever been." And Suga chuckled for the first time, a real laugh this time, eyes crinkling just a bit, and it felt like a breath of air after being underwater too long. But just when the energy began to lighten, Jimmy sat up straighter again and said, "Okay, then this is personal, you ready?" And Suga nodded, his posture still calm, still guarded but willing, and Jimmy said, "If tonight was the last time you'd ever speak on a stage like this, what's the one thing you'd want ARMY to remember? Not about BTS, but about you?" And even before Suga could open his mouth, the room thickened again with emotional gravity, and Suga paused, eyes slightly wider now, maybe realizing the weight of that hypothetical, or maybe because he'd already known the answer all along but never had the stage to say it. And then very quietly, almost as if speaking only to the ARMY watching from screens around the world, he said, "That I never stopped writing for them, even when I stopped releasing." And for a moment the audience didn't move, didn't cheer, didn't even breathe, as if those words needed to settle somewhere deep first, and Jimmy blinked, visibly moved, his voice lower now as he said, "You mean you've been writing songs, but not putting them out?" And Suga nodded with a look that carried both conviction and a strange kind of sorrow, replying, "Sometimes the songs felt too honest. Not for the charts, not for the radio, just for me, and maybe one day, for them. And it wasn't about music anymore. It was about how even in the silence, Suga was creating, storing, documenting the parts of himself he didn't know how to share yet, and the thought of folders full of unreleased pieces of him, made the room feel like it was holding a secret it didn't know it wanted." And Jimmy leaned in again, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Can I ask, is there one you still listen to, for yourself?" And Suga smiled faintly, eyes narrowing like remembering something distant yet intimate, and said, "Yeah. There's one I wrote in the middle of a storm. I didn't even write it to be heard. It's just me talking to my younger self." And Jimmy, now fully in this emotional orbit, asked quietly, "What did you say to him?" And without missing a beat, Suga replied, that he was right to be scared, but wrong to think he'd stay scared forever. And those words hung in the air like a promise, like a fragment from a journal no one was supposed to read, and in that moment, the wall between artist and audience felt thinner than ever, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything that didn't need to be said, but still felt, and Jimmy nodded slowly, as if unable to speak for a second, then finally managed to say, "I think you just changed how a lot of people see you, maybe even how they see themselves." And Suga didn't react much to that. He just looked down at his hands for a second, then back up with that same steady gaze and said, "I didn't come here to be understood. I came here to be real." And as the words settled, you could see a few people in the audience wiping their eyes quietly, the camera panning just enough to catch the mix of awe, emotion, and stillness that had taken over the room. And Jimmy, now visibly more reflective than before, leaned back and said with a small smile, "Yoongi, this might be the most honest conversation I've ever had on this stage." And Suga simply nodded, nothing grand, nothing theatrical, just a silent acknowledgement of what had happened, what had been felt. But then Jimmy glanced at the clock subtly, a producer offstage gesturing slightly, and he said, "If this industry took everything from you tomorrow, your fame, your music, your platform, what would still make you feel like Suga?" And in that instant, it didn't feel like a late-night show anymore. It felt like a confessional broadcast to millions. A soul being peeled back on national television, and Suga didn't smile, didn't flinch. He simply looked into the void between him and Jimmy as if the answer was already carved inside him. Then said in a voice that didn't shake, didn't rise, but carried a calm that echoed louder than any shout. The part of me that still creates, even if no one ever hears it. And Jimmy blinked, clearly shaken by the purity of that response, and the crowd exhaled, not in applause, but as if they'd just witnessed something sacred, because this wasn't scripted, it wasn't packaged, it was raw and unfiltered, and Suga didn't seem to be looking for sympathy or validation, he just told the truth, and for a moment, the two men sat there in silence, letting the answer linger like a fog you didn't want to escape from, and then Jimmy cleared his throat slightly and said, "I hope you know. You've given a lot more than just music tonight." And Suga, eyes still fixed on nothing in particular, responded. Sometimes words without melody hit deeper than a chorus. And that line, that simple but profound statement, sent another wave of stillness across the studio, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for applause, because it's too busy making you feel. And then, just as the show's musical cue began to fade in softly in the background, Jimmy looked at him and said, "Yoongi, I don't think we'll forget this moment." To which Suga finally turned his full gaze to Jimmy and nodded once, slowly, then looked out at the audience and said into the mic with the most delicate sincerity, "Thank you for listening tonight, not just hearing." And as the crowd slowly rose to their feet, clapping not with the wild energy of fandom but with the deep respect of people who had just witnessed something irreplaceable, Suga stood up, gave a slight bow, and Jimmy rose too, reaching out to shake his hand not like a host but like a man who had just shared something sacred with another. And for a second before the lights dimmed, the camera caught Suga looking up into the rafters, where nothing but the black ceiling hung, and he smiled. Not at anyone, but perhaps at the younger version of himself who once wondered if anyone would ever truly understand why he writes, why he performs, why he even speaks at all. And just as the outro music swelled and the final frame of the show lingered on his silhouette stepping away from the chair, Jimmy Kimmel turned to the camera and whispered, "Some interviews make noise, others make meaning, tonight was the latter." And the screen faded to black, but the weight of what had just happened refused to leave the room, and somewhere out there, fans replayed that moment again and again, not because it was shocking, but because in a world filled with so much sound, it was finally something that made them feel silent inside. And yet right as the credits rolled, there was still one lingering mystery that no one could let go of, because just before Suga exited the stage, the camera caught a flash of something in his hand, not a phone, not a note, but a tiny black USB drive. One he never mentioned, never explained, and never looked back at as he walked away. And that single frame, less than a second long, became the most dissected moment on the internet within minutes. Because while the entire world was still emotionally reeling from the soul-bearing interview that had just aired, eagle-eyed fans began circulating a freeze frame of Suga's right hand, casually slipping a small black USB into his jacket pocket just as he turned his back on the spotlight. And suddenly all the conversations shifted, not away from the gravity of what he said, but toward the question of what he didn't say, because no one had expected this. Not even the staff on set, who later admitted anonymously that there had been no mention of any additional material or props involved in the show. And it wasn't part of any gimmick or product placement either. It was something deeply personal, intentional, almost ritualistic in the way Suga held it. Tight, with purpose, like it meant more than any word he'd spoken on stage, and by the time clips flooded social media with the hashtag #Sugaus climbing into global trends within 30 minutes, theories erupted like wildfire, with some fans convinced it held the unreleased tracks he had hinted at during the show, others speculating it contained a video letter, a personal archive, or even the song he wrote to his younger self. And what added even more fuel to the fire was a brief interaction caught off camera just as the show ended, where one of the backstage assistants, clearly unaware she was being recorded by a mirror reflection, was seen whispering to another staff member. He said, "This is the only copy left," before he walked out. And that cryptic remark sent Army into a frenzy, because if what he held truly was the only copy, it meant Suga had been carrying something priceless, something no one else had access to, something that perhaps he never intended to share. Or maybe he was just waiting for the right time, the right listener. And while Big Hit declined to comment officially, fans pointed out that this wasn't the first time Suga had hinted at storing important files on physical devices, referencing past interviews where he mentioned keeping demos and early lyrics on hard drives rather than cloud systems, because it feels more real that way. And the idea that this small USB might contain fragments of his untouched creative soul, the parts he wrote not to impress, not to chart, but to survive, was enough to ignite a global emotional response unlike anything since BTS's hiatus announcement. And what made it even more haunting was a tweet from one of the show's editors who posted and quickly deleted. "I saw what was on the label. It was just one word. Closure." And whether that was true or not, no one could say for sure, but the internet didn't need confirmation. What they had was a moment, a mystery, and the haunting weight of every word Suga had just shared on stage. And now, with that USB as a visual metaphor for all the things he hadn't said, the conversation deepened from admiration to collective longing. Longing for what was on that drive, longing to understand what Suga meant when he said he was still creating in silence. Longing to know whether one day that silence would break, and if the world would ever be ready for what poured out when it did. And just as fans were still debating the meaning behind that final gesture, one of the studio audience members uploaded a blurry photo taken seconds after the credits rolled, showing Suga standing at the exit door, head bowed slightly, as if in a private moment of reflection, and above him, barely visible through the flicker of backstage lights, was a handwritten sign someone had taped to the back wall that read, "Before you go, remember who you were when you started." And the fact that Suga had paused beneath that sign, long enough to be caught in one frame, made it all feel intentional, full circle, poetic in a way that no press release could ever replicate. And so now, the question isn't just what was on that USB, but whether it was ever meant to be opened, or whether its mere existence was the message all along. And as the frenzy surrounding the mysterious USB intensified, turning timelines into theory threads and YouTube reaction channels into investigative hubs, something unexpected happened that shook the entire fanbase again. Suga posted a photo on his personal account, not with any caption, not tagged, not staged, just a dimly lit image of a single object resting on a wooden table. The black USB drive, untouched, unlabeled to the untrained eye, but those who had watched every second of the Jimmy Kimmel Live broadcast knew exactly what it was. And, within seconds, the comment section exploded with cries of disbelief, heartbreak, and desperate curiosity, because if he had posted it, it meant he wanted people to see it, but the silence that accompanied it, the refusal to clarify or explain, only made the mystery deeper. And just when fans thought that would be the end of it, the real twist came in the form of a second photo uploaded 2 hours later, one that looked nothing like the first. It was a grainy scan of what appeared to be a torn page from a notebook, handwritten in Korean with smudged ink and uneven lines, like it had been scribbled in a hurry or under emotional pressure. And though Suga didn't say whose writing it was, ARMY immediately recognized the penmanship from past glimpses in behind-the-scenes footage, and while translations varied, one consistent phrase stood out among the chaos. This song was never meant to be finished, and now the implications became unbearable, because what if the USB contained that unfinished song, the one he spoke about with Jimmy, the one meant only for his younger self, and now inadvertently, perhaps even reluctantly, shared with the world in fragments. And some fans argued that this was Suga's way of inviting people into a space he never let anyone enter before, not by forcing it into a release, not by teasing a drop, but by showing the relics, the remnants, and letting people feel their weight without ever hearing a single note. And amid this emotional storm, Jimmy Kimmel himself added fuel to the narrative fire by tweeting simply, "He left something behind." And no one knew whether that was literal or metaphorical, but the internet didn't care, because the mystique was now legend, and ARMY began sharing their own stories, their own letters to their younger selves, inspired by Suga's words, filling timelines with a global chorus of voices reclaiming their hidden truths. And for once,